the Age of Fission radio show with your host, Lonnie Clark. We stand together and accept that we now live in a world transformed by Fukushima. From 8 a.m. to 9 a.m. Pacific Standard Time here on UCY.TV radio. We relentlessly engage every ear that listens. We expose and confront the complete lack of accountability for the nuclear industry. Consider social engineering programs who view our bodies, minds, and souls as assets on a balance sheet. We discuss vital current issues, interview activists, and engage our audience in an effort to allow all voices to be heard. The Age of Vision radio show creates a venue that all will choose. We encourage our listeners to reclaim their power and their courage to take action and save our planet from the ravages of greed and indifference. Our actions matter. Every voice matters. We remind our listeners that happiness is resistance. Love is greater than fear.
Good morning, UCY.TV radio listeners. I hope you're well. My name is Jerome, and I am the Sane Environmentalist. I apologize for a bit of a bumpy start there. I kind of got wrapped up in my research that I'm doing right now, and momentarily forgot what the heck I was doing. So I'd like to give a shout out to UCY.TV. I'd like to give a shout out to Rocky Flats, to Lonnie Clark, my co-host in this whole process. And also I'd like to give a shout out to our local area Eugene Radio, Eugene Peaceworks, KEPW, 97.3 FM. Look forward to hearing me live on their air sooner than later. So if anybody has a software method that you know of to be able to stream audio over Skype without having to use a microphone on a speaker, I'd certainly appreciate that sort of input. That would be good. And if you're watching this on YouTube, you can put a comment, or you can email me at hebertjerome@gmail.com too. So last couple shows we've been talking about Rocky Flats, and how Rocky Flats is this big giant area just outside of Denver, between Denver and Boulder. A lot of areas of North Denver are right there next to Rocky Flats. And it is a hideously contaminated mess. The whole thing is. It's basically buried over with, I think, a meter of soil. And that's it. They didn't really do much to clean the place up. You know, and as we're going to see today, some things happened over there. Some contamination occurred. One of the main things that actually triggered, finally, the raid on Rocky Flats was when one of the investigators saw an aerial multispectral image. Multispectral meaning it picks up heat and light and other things. And they saw hot spots of cesium-137 and strontium-90 all around the plant. And they're like, well, what in the world is that? What and the guy's like, well, that's cesium and strontium. And the investigator said, well, how? That's not supposed to be here. I mean, what are we doing with any cesium or strontium? And the guy's like, well, World War II weapons tests and nuking people, and yeah, it's everywhere. Trust me, that stuff is literally everywhere now. You're going to always find a little bit of it. But this is above background. And there's only one thing that creates strontium-90 and cesium-137, and that is a fission, a plutonium fission or uranium fission. Which means that there was actual fissioning events that occurred at the Rocky Flats nuclear weapons plant. Probably in the dust that they were using. I wouldn't be surprised if the 57 and the 69 fire were both a direct result of a spontaneous fissioning. Just really ugly stuff. Dealing with a substance that is so deadly, if you just get a pile big enough of it and get it wet, done, it explodes. And I'm not sure with the fissioning event if it would be a real violent explosion so much as it would just be a flash and a huge, massive burst of radiation, of gamma and neutron radiation. Blinding blue light, and then you're dosed. That's it. Pretty much all the firefighters that battled those fires are now dead. They have all died of either cancer or lung disorders from breathing it. But that fire killed everybody that fought it. Both of them. And those men were heroic. If the roof would have collapsed on the second fire, we would now be looking at literally Denver would be a Chernobyl. It would be overgrown. It would be a Chernobyl. I don't know if any of you have been to Denver, but it is a big city. And even back then, it was a big city. So I'm going to read this article that I found about the contamination from the Rocky Flats plant. So Rocky Flats is obviously a former U.S. nuclear weapons production facility. It's located 15 miles northwest of Denver. And it did cause radioactive, primarily plutonium, americium, and uranium contamination within and outside its boundaries. Primarily, the contamination resulted in plutonium fires in 1957 and 1969. Plutonium is pyrophoric and shavings can spontaneously combust, and also from windblown plutonium that leaked from barrels of radioactive waste. Much lower concentrations of radioactive isotopes were released through the operational life of the plant from 52 to 92. From smaller accidents and from normal operational releases of plutonium particles too small to be filtered. Prevailing winds from the plant carried airborne contamination south and east in the populated areas of northwest Denver, where I was as a 6-year-old child digging in the sandbox behind the school. Contamination of the Denver area by plutonium from the fires and other sources was not publicly reported until the 70s, according to a 72 study in the more densely populated areas of Denver. The plutonium contamination level in surface soils was several times fallout levels, and the plutonium contamination just east of the plant ranged from hundreds of times that generated by a nuclear test. As noted by Carl Johnson in Ambio magazine, exposure of a large population in the Denver area to plutonium and other radionuclides in the exhaust plumes from the plant date back to 1953. Weapons production at the plant was halted after a combined FBI and EPA raid in the 1989 and years of protests. The plant has since shut down, with its buildings all being demolished and completely removed from the site. The Rocky Flats plant was declared a Superfund site in 1989 and began its transformation to a cleanup site in February of 1992. Removal of the plant and surface contamination was largely completed in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Nearly all underground contamination was left in place, and measurable radioactive environmental contamination in and around Rocky Flats will persist for thousands of years. The land formerly occupied by the plant is now the Rocky Flats National Wildlife Refuge, and plans to make this refuge accessible for recreation and camping have been repeatedly delayed due to lack of funding and protests by citizen organizations. Thank God for citizen organizations. Maybe they'll keep people somewhat safe out there. The Department of Energy continues to fund monitoring of the site, but private groups and researchers remain concerned about the extent and long-term public health consequences of the contamination. Estimates of the public health risk caused by the contamination varies significantly, with accusations that the United States government is being too secretive and that citizen activists are being alarmists. That would be me. Am I an alarmist? That's the very reason that I call myself the sane environmentalist, because I try not to be alarmist. So, a comprehensive risk assessment to the site by the EPA found it to be safe. In 1998, independent study by the Colorado Department of Health found no increase in cancer incidences, rare or otherwise. Study did not show a conclusive link to cancer and Rocky Flats. In September 2017, CDPHE's Cancer Registry released a supplement to this study in response to public interest. The supplement looked at the incidence of thyroid and all rare cancers in communities around Rocky Flats. And again, data showed no evidence of higher than expected rates of thyroid cancer. However, the supplement identified a statistically higher rate of pancreatic cancer in men in Wheat Ridge. And they blame that because they say that all the men in Wheat Ridge are overweight, obese, had diabetes, family history, or smoked, or used alcohol heavily. I've lived in Wheat Ridge. Well, it's a nice, quiet little family place. It's nothing like that. So, the Rocky plant, just south of Boulder and northwest of Denver, originally under the management of Dow Chemical, managed and transferred to Rockwell in 1975. It had initially had an area of 4 square miles, and then they expanded it with a buffer zone in 1972, probably because they had polluted the whole area. The Fat Man nuclear bomb was made there, the trigger for it, or the bomb itself, because it was an atomic bomb. And I think maybe now is a good time to talk about the difference between atomic and nuclear bombs. An atomic bomb is basically just a critical mass of plutonium surrounded by a shell of a neutron reflector that creates not just a chain reaction, but an intensely bigger chain reaction, because the reflection of the neutrons back into the plutonium creates mass fissioning all at the same time. So that's an atomic bomb, atom bomb. Boom. It's either a uranium or a plutonium explosion, or a mix of the two. And the way it works is you get a certain weight of the stuff, a certain number of moles of it. It's about 10 pounds in one place, in the right shape, and it will spontaneously fission. It will start splitting because there's enough neutrons flowing off of the decaying plutonium atoms to trigger what do they call it? A reaction, a nuclear reaction, chain reaction, and an uncontrolled one at that. So the way that a nuclear weapon works is different from an atomic weapon. Okay, and all of the nuclear weapons in the world are a two-part weapon. You have an inner part, kind of like a avocado seed. You could look at it like an avocado. You've got an avocado seed, and then you've got a layer of tritium, and there's one other elemental gas that they use. And then outside of that, you have, again, the reflector. And what happens is the atomic explosion in the middle of it expands outward, and it, for long enough to where it squeezes together the tritium and every other things and causes a fusion reaction. Okay, that's what the sun does. Now, a fusion reaction is orders of magnitude greater than a fission reaction. Which is why we went from 50 kilotons to 15 megatons in one generation. Once we figured out how to use that fusion, then all of a sudden things changed. So our whole arsenal of weapons is composed of these fission, fusion warheads. It's a two-part thing. Now, the inner core, even though, and it's almost hard to get your head around this, they use the absolute minimum amount of plutonium they can, the least amount that will produce a critical mass. That's the whole idea. We're trying to get a core, a trigger, if you will, and that's what they did call them, small, so that you can put it in a warhead. It's got to be small, small, small. And so they're using literally the most on the edge. It's just barely a critical mass. And they might have to fire neutrons at it or something even to get it going again. But it's just barely a critical mass. If it was way over a critical mass and they had to keep it separated, that would make the thing infinitely dangerous. So this way, you got to jar it to get it going. But once it gets going, it's done. Then you got 15, 30, 45 megatons of reaction that is going to occur. And for me, I kept wondering, well, okay, if plutonium has a half-life of 24,000 years, then why do they keep needing to make new triggers? Because they're always making them. I mean, I can't believe that we've got an assembly line going for making thousands of these parts, literally thousands of them. And we're putting every single one of those into a new bomb. I can't believe that. I couldn't believe that. It didn't make sense. And finally it came to me that what happens is, and this is part of the Rocky Flats mission, what happens is after about 4 years, the fission trigger of a nuclear weapon actually loses enough plutonium through decay to be below critical mass. So it won't work. So what they got to do is pull the trigger out. It looks the same, trust me. But they take the trigger out. They send it off to a place that chops it up and melts it down, adds new plutonium to it, repurifies it, however they got to do that, and forms it into new triggers, which they send back, and then you stick your new trigger, and then you got a nuclear weapon for the next 4 years. So that is why they had to continuously keep manufacturing these triggers, and keep this in mind, still do. Somewhere, somehow, the United States government is got a full-blown, very busy plutonium factory going, where they are taking cores out and they're grinding them up and they're adding new plutonium, and that's why we need to continuously run nuclear reactors, because those nuclear reactors give us the plutonium we need to build the triggers that we need to maintain our nuclear arsenal. Not just build new weapons, but to maintain the ones we already have. Isn't that a crazy thing? Isn't that just amazing to you? I am so stunned sometimes by the idiocy, I'm going to call it that, of this, the whole concept of what they're doing here. You know, and threatening to end the world, keeping us safe. How is threatening to end the world in any way keeping us safe? And how have we been tricked into believing this? It's really sad to me. So carrying on, the sources of contamination. Most of the radioactive contamination from Rocky Flats came from three sources: a catastrophic fire in 1957, leaking barrels in an outdoor storage area in 1964 to 1968, and another less severe fire in 1969. And they actually left out the Pondcrete as a source, which I'm surprised by. Plutonium used to construct the weapon's fissile components can spontaneously combust at room temperature in air. Additional sources of actinide contamination include inadequate Pondcrete, yep, there you go, vitrifications, and routine releases during the decades of plant operations. Decades. On the evening of September 11th, 1957, plutonium shavings in a box located in Building 771, the Plutonium Recovery and Fabrication Facility, spontaneously ignited. The fire spread to the flammable glove box materials, including plexiglass windows and rubber gloves. The fire rapidly spread through the interconnected glove boxes and ignited a large bank of HEPA filters located in the plenum downstream. Within minutes, the filters had burned out, allowing plutonium particles to escape from the building stacks. This went on for hours and hours, by the way, folks. The building exhaust fan stopped operating finally at 10:40 p.m., which ended the majority of the plutonium releases. Firefighters initially used carbon dioxide fire extinguishers because water can act as a moderator and cause the plutonium to become critical. They resorted to water hoses when a dry fire extinguisher proved ineffective. That's dangerous. They could have had a big fission event. You got very lucky. The 1957 fire released 1.12 pounds of plutonium. 1.12 pounds. There is no... They did a study on, I think it was beagles, I'm not sure. But they could not find a small enough dose of plutonium that wouldn't cause lethal problems in beagles. Poor things, and they're the sweetest animals. The thing is that plutonium is deadly, 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 deadly stuff. And there is no safe amount there. If you get plutonium in your body, the odds of you getting cancer from that plutonium are 90% or better. Okay, and we're talking 1.12 pounds of plutonium, most of which, all of which really, was in particles small enough to float in smoke. Think of about what that means for the citizens of North Denver during that time. they must be covering up the cancer incidences. I know that Commerce City, which is North Denver, and would be very close to the plant, probably that was like always a hellhole. Nobody wanted to live there. Only the poor people lived there. There was a dog food factory there, and the cancer incidences were off the hook. But they blamed chemicals. But I wonder now. I never knew any of this growing up. All through my childhood, I never once heard about Rocky Flats. Nothing. Not a word. I lived in East Denver. You know, we didn't know what the heck was going on out there, or even, in my opinion, that it existed. It wasn't even on my radar, because I never saw it. So that's enough plutonium to kill every single citizen in the city and county of Denver today. And it's all still there, by the way. Well, actually, some of it's gone. Some of it's decayed, but most of it is still there. Isopleth diagrams from studies show portions of the city of Denver, including in the area where the surface sampling detected plutonium. The fact that the fire had resulted in a significant plutonium contamination of surrounding and populated areas remained secret. News reports at the time reported, per the Atomic Energy Commission's briefing, that there was a slight risk of light contamination and that no firefighters had been contaminated. No abnormal radioactivity was reported by the Colorado Public Health Service. We know for a fact today that every single firefighter that fought in that 1957 fire is dead now. And they all died of either cancer or mesothelioma, or those two, basically. Cancer and mesothelioma. None of them died of old age. Every single firefighter. Okay, yet the government was telling us, what? No, this is not bad. Everything's fine. And then we got Pad 903. So, in the process of creating a trigger for a nuclear bomb, you have to shape the plutonium exactly in the right shape. It's got to be a certain shape. They called it a top hat. And it's kind of a button or a round disc with a little slightly concave inside. Two of those go into one trigger. And to shape it, you've got to actually, once you chop it up, melt it down, pour it in a mold, break it out of the mold. Okay, now you got, if anybody's ever looked at or done any messing around with molding aluminum and sand or anything, you'll know it's messy. You got to knock off little bits and pieces. You got to file it. You've got to, in the case of this plutonium, it's hard metal. You got to use tungsten carbide tools to machine this. It's super hard, and therefore it has a certain brittleness about it. And so when it shaves, you do get pretty shavings, but you also do get a shower of little teeny weeny particles. If anybody ever has an opportunity to put on a pair of safety goggles and get close to a lathe where it's shaving a really hard metal, you will see as the metal peels away, and it looks smooth, but if you look really carefully, you'll see tons of little teeny bits and pieces of that heavy metal or hard metal that are flying off as they fracture rather than just peel away. You know, they fracture and break into little pieces and fly in the air. That's what plutonium does. Okay, and so in the process of milling the plutonium, you have to use, of course, oils and cutting fluids to cool the tools, which are, plutonium's already running at 400 degrees Fahrenheit, just all by itself, or hotter. And so, yeah, they had to use lots of oil to cool these pits while they were making them exactly the right shape. And they ended up with a whole bunch of 55-gallon drums of this oil waste, which is basically machine oil and floor sweepings and with plutonium floating in it, and it's just really radioactive. Not much more than an alpha emitter, not like a high-level radioactive, but it still has plutonium in it. And again, plutonium's heavy, it'll settle very quickly to the bottom, which is what it did. And they took these drums and they set them out in a field in Area 903. They called it Pad 903. So it says here, plutonium milling operations produce large quantities of toxic cutting fluid contaminated with particles of plutonium and uranium. Thousands of 55-gallon drums of waste were stored outside in an unprotected earthen area called the 903 Pad Storage Area. They were corroded and leaked nuclides over the years into the soil and water. An estimated 5,000 gallons of plutonium-contained oil leached into the soil between 1964 and 1967. Portions of this waste, mixed with dust and composed Pad 903, became airborne in the heavy winds of the Front Range and contaminated areas off-site to the south and east. Leaking barrels of the Pad 903 released between 19 and 200 grams or 0.4 pounds of plutonium as airborne dust during the storage of subsequent attempts at cleanup. Much more remains interred under Pad 903, which has been paved over with asphalt. So this Pad 903, they had these drums. What are you going to do with them? We'll just stick them out there until we can figure out how to work with them. And so they stuck them out there, and after a couple of years, the corrosive materials in the drums rusted the bottoms out, and splash. From what I understand by the FBI guys, 50% of the drums experienced catastrophic failure, meaning they lost all of their contents. Thousands of gallons of plutonium-laced oil went into the soil. And once plutonium gets into the soil, that's the weirdest thing. Cesium and strontium, both in the soil, have a tendency to sink. Plutonium has a tendency to hang around on the surface of the soil for some reason, and so it gets airborne. And it attaches itself to other little particles which go airborne. And I can tell you from experience, the winds that go up and down the Front Range of Colorado are steady blowing winds. If you want to see the Front Range in the area that I'm talking about, try to find some of my older Down by the Creek videos from last summer. Last summer I was in Fort Collins, and I did a bunch of videos where you can clearly see the whole Front Range, and it is like a wall of mountains going up and down, north and south, and that wind whips up and down there, and then they were like, well, we got to move. They figured out the barrels broke, right? They're like, we got to move the barrels. And so they move them all somewhere. And they just leave that area. They just leave it, and it dries up, and the plutonium goes airborne in the dust as it dries up. I think that 208.4 pounds from thousands of barrels is a euphemism. I think it was probably way more than that. And indeed, there is way more in the soil. You know, it's like and so their solution to that was basically to compact it and then pave it. So they put asphalt over it. Asphalt lasts, 50 years with the earth under it and plants growing through it? 50, 100 years at the most. On the outside, we've got 100 years before that asphalt pad dissolves and all the plutonium starts, and it will, working its way to the surface and into the air and into the lungs of the people of the Denver metro area and into the water supply of the people of the metro Denver area. You know, we're not talking about oh gosh, this could be bad. This is bad. Okay, and we're ignoring it, folks. That pad is absolutely still right there. And all the plutonium just about that was buried or dripped or leaked under that is all still there. There's no doubt about that in my mind. So what are we going to do about it? Are we going to ignore that? And when we're good and dead, then our grandchildren and our great-great-grandchildren are going to start getting off the hook incidents of cancer. What if there's a collective forgetfulness that occurs wherein the people of the metro area just completely forget what's under there, and then everybody goes out there and it grows over, and they think it's a nice little camping area and it's a wild place and it's safe and it's clean, and they let their kids dig in the dirt. Well, right next to the eventually right next to the pad or on it even. Once the asphalt gets buried over with a layer of soil and plants, well then, plutonium, it'll work its way through. That's what plutonium does. It works its way through. It gets into organisms, and that's how it bioaccumulates. And it kills the organisms that it gets into. It's a bone seeker. It goes for your bones. So a lot of people got cancer. Judy Padilla, the Rocky Flats lady that I did her interview a couple weeks ago or last week. She had a mastectomy. She had to have both her breasts removed because of it. But she continued to work there even after that. That's what blows my mind. And that's the same exact kind of thinking as Pad 903. It's like, well, I need the money. Well, something else is more important. And it's all about me. And it's all about my needs. And it's all about what I want. And screw literally everybody else, including my own great-grandchildren, which I'll never know, of course. And because I'll never know them, there's no karma. There's no reason to be moral there. Is that it? Is that there's no reason to be moral about our great-great-grandchildren? Because we'll never know them, and it is truly all about us and what we want to do right now. This is a sad state for humanity to get in. It is, and again, it is the lemming effect. It is the running madly towards the cliff, even though you know it's there. You've been told it's there. You know it's there. You've literally watched the lemmings in front of you fall off of it. Yet you continue to run forward because you believe that somehow it's not affecting you. And that may be true, but you will get to the edge of the cliff. Or even worse, your great-grandchildren will get to the edge of the cliff. So we're in effect committing genocide on our own species. I've said it for years. Humans, being the top of the food chain, we are our own predator. That's how it's evolved. It's evolved to where humans have to be our own predator. Unfortunately, we do really stupid things to kill ourselves off. So now we have the 1969 fire. This is another major fire, although they say the plutonium releases from this fire were much lower. And it occurred on May 11th, 1969, in building numbers 776 and 777, the plutonium processing facility. Again, starting due to spontaneous combustion of plutonium shavings in a glove box. Firefighters again resorted to fighting the fire with water after dry extinguishers proved ineffective. And I think this is where we got a criticality. I think either, when you really think about it, they were pretty close and careful about not having spontaneous criticality occur, given the dangerousness of that material. They did pretty good at that, but water could have caused criticality in an area and they didn't even know it. You know, I think there was even a something I read or heard something about they were fighting a fire in a nuclear facility, and there was a bright blue flash, no explosion, just a bright blue flash, and everybody that saw the blue flash in that building died and had severe radiation burns and severe poisoning. You know, imagine that, if you will. Going into a fire, knowing that you will probably be dead from it. And knowing that if you put water on it, you may be seeing that blue flash, and then you and your family and everything changes. So also, despite recommendations after the 57 fire suppression systems were never built into the glove box. The fire bore markers similarities to the 57 fire. The level of contamination, however, was less severe because the HEPA filters in the exhaust system did not burn through. These are the same filters that used to get clogged up. Okay. And they couldn't process it because they couldn't continue to use the line if the filters were plugged up. And so what they would do is they would get a stick and poke the filter to dislodge, in their mind, to dislodge plutonium. You know, but what that in essence really does is it sends plutonium straight up the stack. So just a horrible practice right there, poking the HEPA filter with a stick to get it to work better because it's too clogged, versus just changing the filter. You know, but there again, there you have super highly radioactive filters. Where did they all go? So the HEPA filters did not burn through. After the 57 fire, the filter material was changed from cellulose to non-flammable fiberglass. Had the filters failed, or the roof, which sustained heavy damage, failed, the release could have been more severe than the 57 fire. There was about 1,400 kilograms, or about 300,100 pounds of plutonium in the storage area where the fire occurred. And there was about 7,000 pounds of total plutonium in the building. The 1969 fire released about 0.00198 pounds of plutonium, about 1,000th as much as the 57 fire. The 69 fire, however, led local health officials to perform independent tests of the surrounding areas to determine the extent of the contamination. This resulted in the first release of information to the public that populated areas southeast of Rocky Flats had been contaminated. Rockwell workers also mix hazardous and other wastes with concrete to create 1-ton solid blocks called pondcrete. These were stored in the open under tarps on asphalt pads. The pondcrete turned out to be a weak storage, an outcome that had been predicted by Rockwell's own engineers. Relatively unprotected from the elements, the blocks began to leak and sag. Nitrates, cadmium, low-level radioactive waste all began to leach into the ground and run downhill towards Walnut Creek and Woman Creek. Most of the plutonium from Rocky Flats was oxidized plutonium, which does not readily dissolve in water. A large portion of the plutonium released into the creek sank to the bottom and is now found in the stream beds of Walnut and Woman Creeks and on the bottom of local public reservoirs just outside of Rocky Flats. Great Western Reservoir, no longer used for the city's drinking water, by the way, for the city of Bloomfield, is still used for irrigation. and Stanley Lake, a drinking water supply for Westminster, Thornton, North Glen, and some residents of Federal Heights. As one of the several forms of remediation, once the extent of the lapse at Rocky Flats became public knowledge, several streams that were formed by drainage through the contaminated area of the Rocky Flats plant were diverted so they would no longer flow directly into the local reservoirs, such as Moore Reservoir and Stanley Lake. Also, a surface water control system was built to allow runoff from contaminated creeks to collect in holding ponds, thus reduce or prevent direct runoff into Stanley Lake. Proposals to remove or breach some of these dams to reduce the costs of maintenance have been protested by cities downstream. Just amazing. No radioactive warning, advertisement, or cleanup was provided to the public in the 57 fire, the worst of the two major fires. At the time of the 57 fires, Atomic Energy Commission officials told the Denver Post that the fire resulted in no spread of radioactive contamination of any consequence. The public was not informed of substantial contamination from the 57 plutonium fire until after a highly visible 1969 fire, when civilian monitoring teams confronted government officials with measurements made outside the plant of radioactive contamination suspected to be from the 69 fire, which consumed hundreds of pounds of plutonium. So they're saying that 69 fire consumed hundreds of pounds of plutonium, 850 kilos of it. Yet, the release of plutonium to the environment was, let me find that, not less than a gram, 900 milligrams. .00198 pounds. Yet there were thousands of pounds, hundreds of pounds, 850 kilograms of plutonium lost in the fire. And yet, how does that math work? The 1969 fire raised public awareness of the potential hazards posed by the plant and led to years of increased citizen protests and demands for plant closure. Releases from previous years had not been reported publicly prior to the fire. Airborne become groundborne radioactive contamination extended well beyond Rocky Flats and was not publicly reported until the 1970s. In 2002, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service surveyed tissues harvested from Denver deer that lived at Rocky Flats for plutonium and other actinides. Isotopes of plutonium, americium, and uranium were detected, with the highest measured activity being .0125 picocuries per gram. For uranium-233 or uranium-234, the increased cancer risk as reported by the studies to an individual who ate 28 kilograms of the deer meat over a 70-year lifetime was estimated to be as high as 1 in 210,000. This is near the conservative end of the EPA's acceptable risk range. Acceptable risk? Plutonium-239 and 240 emit strong ionizing radiation in the form of alpha particles. Inhalation is the primary pathway by which plutonium enters the body, though plutonium can also enter the body through a pathway, through a wound, like a little scratch or cut. Once inhaled, plutonium increases the risk of lung cancer, liver cancer, bone cancer, and leukemia. Once absorbed into the body, the biological half-life of plutonium is 200 years. And what that means right there is that once you get plutonium into your body, it stays in your body. It doesn't ever, as long as you're alive, leave your body. Following the public fire in 1969, surveys were taken of the land outside the boundaries of Rocky Flats to quantify the amount of plutonium contamination. Researchers noted that plutonium contamination from the plant was present, but did not match the wind conditions of the 1969 fire. The 1957 fire and leaking barrels on pad 903 have since been confirmed to be the main sources of plutonium contamination. So those barrels. Authors Cray and Hardy estimated the total quantity of plutonium contamination outside the Rocky Flats boundaries to be 36 grams, or 0.079 pounds, while somebody else estimated the value to be more like 92 grams. The study also noted that plutonium levels just outside the boundaries of the plant were hundreds of times higher than the background level caused by global fallout from nuclear testing, and that the contamination north of the plant was probably caused by normal operations rather than accidental releases. And there's another one, normal operations. So during quote-unquote normal operations, this plant was expected to lose plutonium. And that plutonium was expected to carry in the wind to the people nearby living in Boulder, Denver, Wheat Ridge, Longmont, North Glen. It was expected. The government wrote that in. They created that, for the lack of a better word. They were like, well, okay, there's going to be some plutonium, and what is the quote-unquote acceptable risk? I'm sickened by that. From September 47 to 69, there were 5 or more accidental surface water releases of tritium, a radioactive element which is found in scrap materials from Rocky Flats, and it was therefore directed into the Great Western Reservoir. This was uncovered in 73. So those people were drinking tritiated water. Urine samples taken from people living near or working near Broomfield who had drank the water from the reservoir showed that those who were exposed to contaminated water had tritium concentrations near 7 times higher than normal. However, when the same group underwent urine sampling 3 years later, their tritium concentrations had returned to the standard. Is there such a thing as a standard amount of tritium? In 1981, a study by Carl Johnson, health director for Jefferson County, showed a 45% increase in congenital birth defects in the Denver suburbs downwind from Rocky Flats compared to the rest of Colorado. Moreover, he found a 16% increase in cancer rates for those living closest to the plants as compared to those at the outer perimeter of the area. He estimated 491 excess cancer cases, whereas the DOE estimated 1. A 1987 study by Crump and others did not find the cancer rates in northwest portion of Denver to be significantly higher than other parts of the city, and attributed the variance in cancer rates to population density. Crump's conclusions were contested by Johnson in a letter to the journal editor. In a 1992 survey, Radiation Risk Analysis, the authors concluded Johnson failed to describe an effective and complete model for the cause of the cancers and its relationships to other knowledge as Crump et al. Have done. Therefore, Crump and et al. Explanation must be preferred. So basically, yeah, they're higher, the rates are higher, but you can't prove it was from Rocky Flats. It's probably from urban density. That's what they said. In 1983, Colorado University Medical School professor John C. Cobb and the EPA reported plutonium concentrations from about 500 persons who had died in Colorado. A comparison study was done on those who lived near the Rocky Flats and those who lived far from the weapons production site. The ratio of plutonium-240 to plutonium-239 was minutely lower for persons who lived within 50 kilometers of Rocky Flats, but was more strongly correlated to age, gender, and smoking habits than proximity to the plant. In 1991, the Department of Energy's Public Affairs Group, there's a euphemism, published a pamphlet stating that the inhalation of sediments that became suspended in the air is considered the most significant pathway that could expose human beings to plutonium from the contaminated local reservoirs, and also stated that the airborne plutonium concentrations, as measured downwind by air monitors, remain below the DOE's standard. In a 1999 analysis, it was found that the major event contributing to the highest individual risk from plutonium released to Rocky Flats was the 1957 fire, with wind distribution of plutonium from the 903 pad area being the next greatest source. In this analysis, health risk assessments for off-site humans had a variance of 4 orders of magnitude, between 2 and 2.2. So basically what I'm seeing is the government is saying it's fine, and then the private citizens come in. Like this guy in 2003, Dr. James Ruttenberg led a study on the health effects of plutonium conducted by the University of Colorado Health Sciences Center and the Colorado Department of Health and Environment. The study concluded that lung cancer is linked to plutonium inhalation. We have supporting evidence from other studies that, along with our findings, support the hypothesis that plutonium exposure causes lung cancer. Ruttenberg said his group's findings were part of a broader study that tracked 16,300 people who worked at the Rocky Flats between 1952 and 1989. Their research found that these workers were 2.5 times more likely to develop brain tumors than other people. Many findings linked workers and other cancer developments are muddled due to the strong healthy worker effect, that workers tend to have lower overall death rates in general population because those that are ill or disabled are restricted from working. Also, the standard mortality rates for cancers of stomach and rectum were found to be much higher than other studies of nuclear workers, which indicates a necessity to further study the inhalation of plutonium and how that can distribute to these areas. In 2006, the Rocky Flats Stewardship Panel was formed to address post-closure management of the facility. The council includes elected officials of 9 municipal governments neighboring Rocky Flats and 4 skilled organized organizations or individuals. Information about the council is available on their website. That's Rocky Flats Stewardship Council. In 2016, the Colorado Department of Health and Environment announced its cancer registry was preparing to follow up cancer studies from before. So look at that, 58. Somehow I managed to read 1 page in 58 minutes. I must have talked a lot about this. That's good. So we got legal actions going on. And soon, if we don't fix this, something bad's going to happen.